What I would like to do now is look at the naval race as a cause of World War I. All major powers were influenced by the ideas of a man named Alfred Thayer Mahan and his work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Mahan essentially thought that a nation's power was based upon its ability to control the sea. Thus, the more powerful a nation wanted to be, the more powerful a navy it needed to have. And thus, British historian Charles Webster wrote that Mahan was one of the causes of the First World War. And what he meant by that was that because Mahan promulgated or put forth this idea of naval powers being so important, it really had at least some direct influence upon the subsequent naval race that broke out between Britain and Germany. Here's a picture of Mahan. And what's going to happen by the late 19th century and the early 20th century is we're going to see the emergence of a powerful German navy. It was really Germany's goal to build a navy to rival Great Britain, which of course was the greatest naval power at that time in history. And as we can see from the 1880s right up until the eve of World War I, there's a shrinking of the ratio of British to German warship tonnage. It goes from 7.4 to 1 in 1880 to about 2 to 1 in 1914. But I think it's also important to note that the German Navy never was able to reach a point where it more or less equaled or surpassed the British Navy. That 2 to 1 ratio is still pretty significant. This man is Alfred von Tirpitz. He was the German Secretary of State for the Navy, and he was responsible for much of Germany's naval growth during this period. Tirpitz put forth the idea that if Germany had a great navy or a powerful navy, that it would be able to gain territorial concessions from Britain. And again, I think Germany also felt that it needed a strong navy to protect the colonial possessions overseas that it already had, as well as to protect its trade. If Germany had a great navy, that would mean that Britain would be reluctant to join France and Russia in a war against the Germans. And so anyway, Tirpitz puts forth a number of what are called naval programs designed to challenge the British naval supremacy. And Britain certainly took note of this, and Britain was certainly worried about this to some extent. In fact, if we go back to the Anglo-Japanese Agreement of 1902, we note that although probably the prime reason of that agreement was to check Russian expansion in the Pacific region, another subsidiary reason would also be that Britain saw the 1902 treaty with Japan as a way to thwart the growth of the German naval fleet and the potential of the German naval fleet. Britain tried to meet the German challenge by developing more powerful types of naval ships. And what I'm talking about here more specifically is the dreadnought. Now, the dreadnought was originally a proper noun. It was the name of a specific ship that was built in 1906, but thereafter it becomes a general name given to all similar types of warships. And the construction of the dreadnought really hastened, or sped up the naval race between the Germans and the British. And on the eve of World War I, Britain had about 19 of these dreadnoughts. Germany had 13. So it's a similar advantage for the British as we saw with the total tonnage. Not quite 2 to 1, but significant nonetheless. Here's a picture of the dreadnought. Now, as I said earlier, Britain was really worried about the expansion of the German Navy. It saw it as a potential threat to its own empire. And so following the end of the Second Moroccan crisis, Britain actually sent its war secretary, Lord Haldane, to Germany to try to negotiate a cooling down of the naval race. Haldane's goal was essentially to assure British dominance, continued British dominance. And basically that meant that the Germans had to agree to a 2 to 1 ratio, meaning that for every 2 ships that the British had, the Germans would have 1. And in fact, the British felt that the naval fleet for Germany was essentially a luxury. Germany was not a maritime power in the eyes of the British. It did not have the great empire that the British did, and therefore did not need a great navy. Now, the Germans looked at Haldane's ideas and responded to them with their own proposition. They basically said, okay, we'll agree to this 2-to-1 ratio if you, the British, promise to remain neutral if a war breaks out between France and Germany. Well, to make a long story short, the British do not agree with this, the Haldane mission fails, and thus the naval race continues right up until the eve of World War I. So what were the overall results of this naval race prior to World War I? Well, Germany never did overtake Britain, and again, that 2-to-1 ratio basically held firm. Some people would criticize Tirpitz for putting too much emphasis on the naval race, that Germany should have allocated its resources to other goals, other military goals. Britain would always have that supremacy, and thus it was kind of a lost cause for the Germans. At least that's what some suggested. And one could also argue that the naval race helped to pull Britain into the alliance system. As the British saw the German threat, for example, they became more and more worried, and therefore were more likely to move towards France and Russia in an alliance against Germany. So again, we can see that for many reasons, the naval race perhaps contributed, at least indirectly, to World War I by increasing tensions among the great powers.